Have you ever wondered why one of the most inhumane ideas in American history is written directly into the nation's founding document? Not hidden, not implied, but calculated. Down to a fraction. This is the story of the 3/5 Compromise of 1787 and why it reveals the depth of hate embedded into the foundation of the United States. Follow if you've never heard this story, because this wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a mistake. It was a deliberate political strategy built on dehumanization. What the 3/5 Compromise was in 1787, as delegates gathered to draft the U.S. Constitution, they faced a problem, one they created themselves. How should enslaved Africans be counted when determining congressional representation, electoral college votes, federal taxation? Southern states wanted enslaved people counted to increase their political power, even though those same people had no rights, no freedom, and no citizenship. Northern states pushed back, arguing that if enslaved people were treated as property, they should not be counted at all. The compromise they reached was chilling. Each enslaved person would count as 3/5 of a human being for political purposes, not for protection, not for rights, but for power. The ugly intent behind the compromise. Let's be clear about intent. Southern states did not want enslaved people recognized as human beings. They wanted more seats in Congress, more influence in presidential elections, more control over federal policy. The 3/5 Compromise allowed them to inflate their political representation without granting enslaved people a single right. Enslaved Africans were reduced to a fraction, 60% of a person, on paper, while being treated as 0% human in life. This wasn't compromise in the moral sense. It was exploitation written into law. Why this gave the South enormous power? Because of the 3/5 Compromise, slaveholding states gained dozens of extra seats in the House of Representatives and a massive advantage in the Electoral College. This directly shaped American leadership. For decades, slaveholding presidents dominated the White House. Pro-slavery legislators controlled Congress. Laws protecting slavery passed repeatedly. Without the 3/5 Compromise, many of these outcomes would have been mathematically impossible. Slavery didn't just survive because of violence. It survived because of arithmetic. Slavery protected by the Constitution. The Constitution is often described as a document of liberty, but from its very beginning, it protected slavery. The 3/5 Compromise worked alongside the Fugitive Slave Clause, the delay of banning the international slave trade, federal enforcement of slave catchers. Together, these provisions embedded slavery into the nation's legal structure. This is why historians often call the 3/5 Compromise America's original sin. The nation proclaimed freedom, while legally defining black people as fractions. The psychological violence of being 3/5. The harm of the 3/5 Compromise wasn't only political, it was psychological. To be counted, but not protected. To be used, but not acknowledged. To be human enough for power, but not human enough for rights. This logic taught generations of Americans that black life was measurable, negotiable, disposable. That belief didn't disappear when the clause was repealed. It echoed forward into segregation, policing, housing, education, and health. Was it ever a step forward? Some historians argue that the compromise technically acknowledged enslaved people as something more than property, but that argument collapses under scrutiny. If enslaved people were truly seen as human, they would have been granted legal standing, protection under the law, representation of their own choosing. They were not. The 3/5 Compromise did not elevate enslaved people. It elevated slaveholders, how it shaped federal law. Because of the power imbalance created by the compromise, slaveholding states dominated federal policy. This influence enabled the expansion of slavery into new territories, laws like the Kansas-Nebraska Act, repeated compromises favoring slave interests. Every time the nation tried to resolve the slavery question, the math favored the enslavers. not because they were right, but because the Constitution said they were worth more. The long delay of justice. The 3/5 Compromise remained in effect until 1868, when it was nullified by Section 2 of the 14th Amendment after the Civil War. That means for 81 years, the United States officially counted enslaved Africans as fractions of people. Even after emancipation, Black Americans were still denied full voting rights, equal protection, fair representation. Ending the clause did not end its legacy. Why this still matters today. The 3/5 Compromise explains why slaveholding states held power for so long, why racial inequality was baked into governance, why disparities persist in representation today. This wasn't ancient history. It shaped political boundaries, electoral systems, institutional behavior. You cannot understand modern America without confronting this truth. The depth of hate. The 3/5 Compromise reveals something uncomfortable. America didn't merely tolerate slavery, it optimized it. It measured black bodies. It converted suffering into votes. It built a nation where dehumanization was constitutional. That is the depth of hate we must acknowledge, not to dwell in it, but to dismantle its legacy. Closing reflection. The Constitution was not neutral. It made choices, and one of those choices declared that black life was divisible. Understanding this history doesn't weaken America. It tells the truth about it, and truth is the only foundation strong enough to build justice. Subscribe here to uncover more hidden black stories. Comment if you'd like to hear more about the 3/5 Compromise. We don't glorify injustice. We reveal truth, so history can't repeat itself.